Good evening, everyone. My name is Dave Van Zandt. I'm the president here at the New School, and I want to welcome Professor Joseph Stiglitz to join us tonight. Thank you for being here, and also welcome to our distinguished guests, the students and members of the press, as well as other friends of the New School. It's great to have you here. Tonight, we will hear a lecture by Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz, and they'll follow that with a conversation about the ideas he puts forth in his lecture and his new book entitled "The Price of Inequality: How Today's Divided Society Endangers Our Future." The New School has had a long commitment to two core principles. The first of those is to be innovative, to be on the cutting edge, to always challenge the status quo, and to be creative. The second of those principles is to be socially engaged in a way that's going to improve society and further social justice. We have a long tradition of welcoming and initiating dialogue about social, economic, political, and cultural issues of our day. We look at economic theory in the context of the broader society and try to challenge the current paradigms and the limits of existing disciplines. This is true whether we're talking about our various departments in public policy, international affairs, urban design and development. Questions of social and economic justice are really at the core of our work. And that's really why we're honored to have Joe Stiglitz with us tonight. Our speaker, Joseph Stiglitz, is of course a Nobel winner, but he's also, I just found this out, a dual Nobel winner in a sense. He won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2001, but 6 years before then, he was the lead author on the 1995 International Panel on Climate Change, which ended up sharing the Nobel Prize in 2007. This was the Peace Prize. So I looked it up. There's only about five dual winners of the Nobel Prize out there ever in all of history. He also served on President Clinton's economic team as a member and then chairman of the U.S. Council of Economic Advisors in the mid-1990s. He served as the chief economist and senior vice president at the World Bank, and he helped create a branch of economics, the economics of information, which explains the circumstances in which markets do not work well and how selective government interventions can improve their performance. In fact, Joe, for my personal self and many other people, the 1970 article, The Market for Lemons, was a real influence. He has been a Fulbright Scholar at Cambridge University. He's held the Drummond Professorship at All Souls College in Oxford and has taught at MIT, Yale, Stanford, and Princeton. Currently, he's a university professor at Columbia University, where he co-chairs the Committee on Global Thought and is founder and co-president of the Initiative for Policy Dialogue. In addition, he's also, we go on and on, right? He's the president of the International Economic Association. He's a co-chair of the Commission on Measurement and the Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress, the chair of the Commission of Experts of the President of the United Nations General Assembly on reforms of the international monetary and financial system. He's written numerous books in addition to the one tonight, as well as articles, and he will be speaking about his latest tonight. So let me just tell you the schedule for the evening. We're going to ask Professor Stiglitz to speak for about 30 minutes. Then we will have a conversation, and we'll be joined, who are already up here on the stage, by two New School faculty members, Teresa Ghilarducci and Mike Cohen. Teresa is a labor economist and nationally recognized expert in retirement security. She holds the Bernard L. and Irene Schwartz Chair in Economic Policy Analysis. She's a director of the Schwartz Center for Economic Policy Analysis and joined the New School in 2008 after 25 years as a professor of economics at Notre Dame. She, again, is an author of numerous articles, including most recently, When I'm 64, The Plot Against Pensions and the Plan to Save Them. Mike Cohen is an urban and development policy specialist. He's a professor of international affairs and the director of our graduate program of international affairs in the Milano School here at the New School. Prior to the New School, he had a distinguished career at the World Bank, where he served as a senior advisor to the bank's vice president for environmentally sustainable development. He's worked in over 50 countries and was heavily involved in the bank's work on infrastructure, environment, and sustainable development. He's taught at Berkeley, Johns Hopkins, and the University of Buenos Aires. And finally, he's the author of several books, including most recently, Argentina's Economic Growth and Recovery, The Economy in a Time for Default. So now that I've got the pleasantries out of the way, let's welcome Joseph Stiglitz to the podium.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be back here again. This book grew out of an article that some of you may have read in Vanity Fair, which, for those of you aspiring academics, is not the usual place for publishing your research, and it may not even count for promotion. But I wasn't at the time worried about that. But my interest in, and the title of that article, I'll come back to a little bit later, is Of the 1%, For the 1%, and By the 1%. And that article, in a way, summarizes a lot of what has been going on in the country. My interest, actually, in inequality and distribution of income, though, goes back to my PhD thesis at MIT. And one of the chapters of that thesis was published in Econometrica. I urge you to read it. But what I can say is that the readership in Vanity Fair was bigger than my readership in Econometrica. The subject of the title 1% tried to say that actually the country isn't that badly divided. Most of the country is in one boat. Most of the country is together. It's just a small fraction. It's actually a fraction of that 1% that's going off in a different direction. One of the presidential candidates has said you shouldn't talk about all these things. He's labeled it the politics of envy, and they should only talk about these things in closed rooms and quiet tones. I would argue this is not about the politics of envy. The real debate is about the justification and the consequences of the level that inequality has attained in the United States today. That level is really unprecedented and multidimensional. To talk about just one aspect of it, and there are many aspects, what's happening at the top, the middle, the bottom, and I'll try to touch on most of those, but you've given me only half an hour, so we won't be able to do all of it. The top 1% today gets about 20 to 25% of all of the national income. And this number is twice what it was 30 years ago at the beginning of the Reagan administration. The top 1/10 of 1% gets 3 to 4 times the amount that it got 30 years ago. And in terms of income, things are even more unequal. The top 1% gets over a third. In terms of wealth, it gets over a third of all the wealth. Even more disturbing to me is that America is no longer the land of opportunity. You all know that the America dream, the notion of Horatio Alger, anybody can make it from the bottom to the top, has really been part of America's conception of itself. But the fact of the matter is that today, America has become not only the country with the most inequality of all the advanced industrial countries, and that's both before tax and transfer and after tax and transfer, but also the United States has become the country with the least equality of opportunity of any of the advanced industrial countries for which there's data. And what that means is the life chances of a young person in the United States are more dependent on the income and education of his parents than in any of these other countries. The fact that there is this very different experiences in different countries, that level of inequality is greater, the level of equality of opportunity is less than in other countries, tells something very important. A lot of people talk about inequality, and the natural beginning point for economists is to say, oh, this is driven by market forces, and we try to understand market forces. But one of the main messages of the book is that, really, the same market forces are in operation in all the other advanced industrial countries. The same, we live in a globalized economy, and they're operating there just as much as they're operating here. But the outcomes are very different here than there. And that raises the question, well, how do we explain this? And what I suggest is that markets don't exist in a vacuum. The process, politics shapes markets. The laws and regulations that we have shapes the way that markets work, and in doing so, they shape the outcomes, the level of inequality, the level of equality of opportunity. In a way, that's a hopeful note, because what it says is the level of inequality is not inevitable. We can actually change it. We change the laws, regulations, that we can change the degree of inequality in our society. Not only is it the case that it's not inevitable that we have the high level, it's not inevitable that we have the increase in inequality that we've been experiencing. There are some countries that have been moving in the other direction, or at least there's some evidence that they've been moving in the other direction. One country that I think is very interesting is Brazil. One way of looking at what's happened there, Brazil has a very high level of inequality, much higher actually even today than the United States. But about 20 years ago, they looked over the brink, they saw where their society was going, and they decided they didn't want to go there. And there was essentially a consensus across society, from the top to the bottom, from the rich to the poor. And beginning under President Cardozo, they started investing very heavily in education for all the citizens. And then President Lula, they continued that with a whole set of programs on hunger, on access to education, on welfare programs. And the interesting thing is, normally these kinds of programs, the effects of them do not show up very quickly in the data. In the case of Brazil, they are showing up in the macroeconomic data. And you can see that there has been a marked reduction in the level of inequality. In the case of the United States, the economic downturn has made things much worse. And later on, I'm going to try to suggest that actually the existence of the economic downturn, the crisis, is in fact related to, in some ways, to inequality in the United States. But now I just want to talk about the consequences of the economic downturn. It's not a surprise that this major economic downturn would have worsened inequality. When you have a major downturn, you have unemployment goes up. When you have high levels of unemployment, there's downward pressure on wages, and the people who get thrown out of jobs tend to be people at the bottom. Social services get cut back, especially when you have a process of austerity that many of the states have, or most of the states have been engaged in. But the magnitude of the effects, I think, are illustrated by two numbers. One of them is that in the first year of recovery, 2010, 93% of all the gains in income in the year accrued to the top 1%, which is just an astounding statistic about the distribution of the gains as we started to recover. Another statistic that came out after the book was published emphasized the magnitude of the losses suffered in the wealth of the typical American. Again, not a surprise, because most Americans at the bottom half have most of their wealth in housing, and housing prices went down enormously. Now, there are two myths that I want to destroy. I've already destroyed one myth, which is that the country is a land of opportunity. So why do we believe myth, but it simply isn't true? Another myth is, it wouldn't be so bad that you shouldn't be worried about what's happening to the top 1%, because we all benefit. And that's the idea that's been called trickle-down economics. You pour money at the top, and everybody benefits. And I wish it were true, because we poured so much money at the top that if it were true, we would all be very well off. But actually, if you look at the data, it's not, as I say, it's not true. Median income, median, remember, is the one income such that half or above, half below. Median income in the United States today for the household is lower than it was a decade and a half ago. But median income for a full-time male worker today is lower than it was more than 40 years ago in 1968. So what this says is that the gains, as our economy has grown, have gone almost all to the top. When we look at wealth, we get the same kind of picture. And again, it's data that came out after the book came out. Median wealth in the United States today is back to the level that it was in the early 90s. So all the growth in our economy and wealth has gone to the people in the top half. Actually, it's gone to the people in the far over the top half. If they had shared in the increase in wealth of our economy over that 20 years, their wealth would have gone up by 75%. So we can see the level of inequality in our society. So in a way, you know, trickle-down economics had the view is don't worry about the fact that you're getting a smaller slice of the pie. The pie is getting bigger, but your slice also is getting bigger, even though your share is getting smaller. The evidence is quite the contrary. You're getting a smaller slice of a growing pie, so much smaller that you're actually walking home with less. Another myth that's been propagated by the economics profession for more than 150 years goes back to how do you justify this inequality? And again, the notion was those who, and you still hear it in a lot of the political rhetoric, that those who receive higher income have contributed more. For those of you who studied economics, you know this as the marginal productivity theory. What gave lie to that idea, made it clear that it was not true, was what happened in the early days of the Great Recession. Because you remember then that the bank executives walked off with huge bonuses. And you ask the question, huge bonuses for what? They hadn't contributed to a stronger economy. They brought the economy into a crisis, a global economy. They hadn't even helped their own firm. Several of these firms were on the brink of ruin. A few of them were so embarrassed by calling that they couldn't call it performance bonus, they changed the name. They didn't change the bonus, they changed the name of the bonus to a retention bonus. But then the question is, why would you retain somebody that had brought you to the brink of ruin? All of this, I think, illustrates the fact that this theory that the people who've made the most contribution or receiving the highest income is really not exactly persuasive. And if you look at the people at the top, say on the Forbes list, you don't see the people who made the big innovations that transformed our economy or society. You don't see people who invented the transistor or the laser or the computer or discovered the DNA or all the things or, invented the internet. These are not the people. Well, who are the people that are at the top? And that brings me to the next part of my talk is how do we explain this inequality? If it's not due to some individuals contributing more, and there's some degree of that, what is it due to? Well, explaining inequality, you have to look at each part of the inequality at the top, the weakening of the middle, the increase of poverty at the bottom. And again, I'm not going to have time to talk about all of these. But a central argument in my book is that a lot of this has to do with what economists call rank seeking. Rank seeking is a very simple idea that there are two ways of getting better off. One is to make the size of the pie bigger. The other one is to get a larger share of an existing pie. And when your efforts are directed at getting a larger share, we think of that as rent-seeking. And the countries in the oil-rich countries we think of as being rent-seeking economy. The nature of these economies is they have a fixed amount of wealth, which is the oil, and what goes on in these societies is they fight over who gets that oil. And we all know what happens as a result of that. These economies don't do very well. It's called the resource curse, and in fact, in that process of fighting over who gets those rents, the size of the economy, the size of the pie gets smaller. Well, what we haven't realized is the extent to which America has become a rent-seeking society. And you look at the people at the top, an awful lot of what goes on has to do with this kind of rent-seeking. Take the financial sector. Paul Volcker pointed out, he looked at all those financial innovations, and he said, the only financial innovation of America that has ever contributed to our growth was, or to well-being, was the ATM machine. And he made one mistake, because the ATM was not an American innovation, it was a British innovation. So he couldn't find a single one that was really related to America's financial market. What they did, how did they get wealth? What they did is they engaged in predatory lending and abusive credit card practices, anti-competitive practices through credit cards, through debit cards, a whole set of things I don't have time to go into, manipulating markets in the LIBOR. You could go on, pick up the newspaper and every day, and you can get a list of to insider trading. You can get a long list, sort of a daily litany of their sins. Well, that was all basically taking money, particularly from the bottom and the middle, and moving it to the top. It wasn't creating wealth, it was moving money around in ways that increased inequality. Better financial regulations would have circumscribed the extent of this. Another major source of rent-seeking is monopoly. Now, some of the monopolists originally made a contribution, they'd made an innovation, but then they leveraged that to get monopoly rents, and that makes it very clear. How do you get monopoly rents? You restrain production from what it otherwise would be. So it actually, the process of getting those monopoly rents makes the economy weaker than it otherwise would be. Another group of people who've done very well are the CEOs, who've taken advantage of weaknesses in our corporate governance laws to get for themselves a larger share of the corporate revenue. If we go through each of the laws, regulations that govern our economy, you can see how they are designed in ways that help create more inequality. One more example that I think is very telling is our bankruptcy law. This sounds like very arcane, but the bankruptcy law, particularly, is passed in under President Bush, had some peculiar provisions. One provision was that when you go bankrupt, the question is, who gets first claim on the resources of the bankrupt firm? First claim went to the derivatives, those risky products, the CDSs that led to AIG needing an $189 billion rescue. Those were given first claim. An important message here is if you give something priority, it diverts resources into this. So in doing that, we were encouraging these risky products. But what's even more striking is a provision that said that student loans could not be discharged even in bankruptcy. So that students were always going to have this noose of student debt around their neck. And as I traveled around discussing my book, this was one of the things that got the most resonance. You go talking, some parent would come up and they would tell this tragic story that they had co-signed the loan of their child and the child had gotten killed and they could not discharge that debt even in bankruptcy. So these are almost inhumane laws, but are laws that contribute to inequality. Well, I could go on, but the basic point I wanted to make, I think, should be clear that a lot of the wealth, a lot of the inequality, particularly at the top, is a result not from contributing to making our economy more efficient, growing our economy, but trying to seize a larger fraction of the resources of our society. And you could talk about that in terms of corporate welfare, in terms of a whole set of hidden subsidies. What is also remarkable about the United States in comparison to other countries, while we have more inequality in before tax and transfer income, we do less about it. And in the last 30 years, as our inequality in before tax and transfer income has increased, we've done less and less about that as well. So that the role of the government in redistributing it and correcting this market, of this market inequality has diminished. We've become less progressive. One example, this comes out has become a central issue in the political campaign. People like Mitt Romney are paying taxes at 14% of their reported income, and a rate which is much less than those who are working hard for their living and making much lower incomes. And one of the reasons are a whole complex set of loopholes deliberately put in and special provisions that if you move your money off to the Cayman Islands, you can escape some of the taxation. The provision that I find most disturbing is the fact that we tax speculators at a fraction of the rate that we tax people who work for a living. Now, that really brings me to the real title of the book, The Price of Inequality. Another myth is that you often hear is, yes, from some people, yes, I understand we don't like inequality, but doing anything about it would kill the golden goose. It would destroy our economy. It would make us all poor. And the title of my book, The Price of Inequality, was chosen to emphasize the fact that actually our society, our economy, and our politics are paying a very high price for this inequality. And much of my discussion focuses on the economic price, but I don't want to underestimate the importance of the effects for our democracy and for our society. But let me focus in the limited amount of time I have on the economic price. Some of this economic price should be pretty apparent from what I've already said. If you tax speculators at a lower rate than you tax people who work for a living, that encourages people to go into speculation rather than in productive activity. It encourages resources to move into speculation rather than into productive activities. And so you're weakening the economy. So each of the areas that I described where we had monopolies, where we had this kind of rent-seeking activity, are activities that are actually weakening our economy. So that if we could attack this aspect of inequality, which is obviously very important at the top, we would have a stronger economy. So that's one of the prices that we pay for inequality. The second goes back to the theme I talked about in the beginning, that America is the country with the least equality of opportunity. And the main reason for that is education. But what does that mean? That means if a child is born to poor parents, the likelihood is that he won't be able to live up to his potential because he won't get the education. He won't, and that means we're wasting one of our most important resources, our human resources. A third reason that inequality, that we pay a very high economic price for our inequality, is that underlying a successful economy are important public investments in education, I just mentioned, but also investments in infrastructure, technology, a whole set of public investments that you need in order for an economy to function. Research, for instance, the most important innovation of the latter part of the last century was the internet, and that was based on the government played a very important role in these investments. And this, if you look at the history of the success of the United States over the last 150, 200 years, it's been repeated examples of government investments in agriculture, in the telegraph, and a whole series of innovations. Well, when you have a divided society, it's very hard to get the consensus behind that support for a couple of reasons. One is the 1% doesn't need public roads. It doesn't need public schools. It doesn't need public health. It doesn't need these publicly provided services. And so they don't support them. And worse than that, they're afraid a strong government might ask them to pay a fair share. And so rather than asking them to pay a fair share, they'd rather say, let's have a weak government that doesn't do all these things. It's sure excited, and I'll come back to that at the end, but that happens not only in the United States, but in many other countries. Countries that are less divided are able to make more of these public investments. The final point has to do with the link between the current economic crisis, which we were paying a huge price for, trillions of dollars of lost output, and inequality. And the basic idea is a very simple one. Giving the full story is a little bit more complicated. The basic idea is pretty simple, that people at the top consume a lower fraction of their income than people at the bottom. They save more than people at the bottom. People at the bottom actually don't save very much at all. And when you redistribute income from the bottom to the top, the effect of this is to lower total demand. And when you lower demand, the economy gets weaker. And then the question is, how do you respond? If the Federal Reserve, your central bank, responds by doing what our central bank did, it said, okay, I have to stimulate the economy. How will I do it? I'll stimulate it by low interest rates and lax regulation, creating a housing bubble. And they did that. But a housing bubble is only a temporary solution to the problem. It was amazingly successful for a while. The bottom 80% of America was consuming 110% of their income. But it should have been clear that that was not sustainable. You don't have to have a PhD to figure that out. And as one of my predecessors as the chairman of the CEA once said, that which is not sustainable won't be sustained. And the result of that, of course, was the crisis. So the point I want to emphasize is that we are paying a high economic price for our inequality. We also are paying a very high political price, and I want to spend just a minute talking about the nexus between politics and economics. One of the main arguments that I made was that the laws and regulations in our economy affect how our economy operates and leads to the level of inequality that we have, and it undermines the strength and vitality of our economy. Well, the question is, don't we live in a democracy? And in a democracy, shouldn't it be the case that the votes reflect the person in the middle? This is called the median voter model, that it should reflect the interest of the middle. And clearly, why do we have a tax system that advantages the top if we have this democracy? And the answer to that is related to this same notion that how politics plays out also depends on the rules of the game. And the rules of the game that we've adopted have resulted in a democracy which is more closely described as $1, one vote than one person, one vote. And examples in recent years of things like Citizens United. A long story. You can probably talk about that a little bit later. But the point is that we have a democracy that I think has not lived up to our aspirations. Well, I'm told my time is up, and so let me conclude with two brief notes. First, the agenda for reform. You'll have to buy the book to get that. But in terms of the basic ideas are pretty clear. If you understand the diagnosis of what causes inequality, you get a fairly clear prescription of what ought to do about it. Pass better competition laws, financial regulations, corporate governance. Obviously, other elements have to do with social legislation, unions, discrimination, education. The problem is it's going to be very difficult to get these kinds of reforms, and that means really the more fundamental reforms we need are political reforms. They have to do with campaign finance, dealing with the issues of revolving doors, lobbying, and so forth. The final question that I guess asked all the time is there hope? That's a hard question. I jokingly say that my publisher said I should end on a hopeful note because people don't want to read a book and leave it on a downer. I wrote a book a few years ago called The $3 Trillion True Cost of the Iraq War, the $3 trillion war. And it was pretty depressing, I have to say. It's still depressing. You know, with data like almost 1 out of 2 Americans coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan are disabled. And, you know, the cost of these disabilities, healthcare, disability costs are just enormous. Interestingly, when the book first came out, a lot of people said we were exaggerating. Now the data is very clear that we were, as we said we were, very conservative. These costs have been significantly larger than we said at the time. But while it had considerable influence in Washington, and I think a lot of the recommendations that we made were followed, nobody wanted to buy the book because it was so depressing. So let me tell you a little bit, end on a little bit of a high note. And that is, there have been other periods in our history when there's been comparable levels of inequality. The Gilded Age at the end of the 19th century, the Roaring '20s. And each of those instances, we looked at where the country was going. Our democracy worked and we pulled back from the brink. The Gilded Age was followed by the Progressive Era, the Roaring '20s by the important social legislation of the '30s. My hope is that as people will understand the depths to which, the magnitude to which inequality has increased and the extent to which inequality of opportunity has really decreased, to the extent that they come to understand that we are paying a very high price for this inequality, not only for our economy, but for our democracy and for our society, that we once again will pull back from the brink and that we will adopt the kind of agenda that I talk about that can bring us, reduce the divides that have marked our society in recent years. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much. That was tremendous. That was tremendous. And I like ending on a note of hope, too. What I'd like to do is just to ask first Teresa, just to have a few comments about what you heard or read, and then we'll turn to Mike.
Sure. Well, one piece of hope is if you study economics at the New School, and there's a handout that describes the 21 faculty of economists at the New School, then you will get a lot of the kind of the critique that we got here of modern economic myths. And I hope a real understanding of what Professor Stiglitz has tried to do here is to draw the line about how the economy really works and then the solutions to make it work better. So there are 3 really terrific points in this book. The first one is that it overturns what Arthur Oken's book that influenced many undergraduates for a couple of decades, because every undergraduate, even freshmen in freshman seminars, had to read the book called Equality and it was equality and efficiency, colon, the big trade-off. And that big trade-off is just wrong. And what Stiglitz does here is just walk you through that argument, that actually an economy that is more equal, and an economy like ours that takes measures to make it more equal, is an economy that works better. That's the one reason why you should buy this book. The second reason is that it describes one of the most important ideas in modern economics, and that is that markets often lead to this behavior that's very wasteful, that gives a minority of people great wealth, and with that wealth becomes a lot of power, and that behavior is called rent seeking. It used to be rents were something that you paid somebody who owned land, or what you actually paid to your landlord. But it really is expanded to describe the wealth that occurs when you're given a right to control something. So rents are activity that's not productive, and that if it's taxed, it does not lead to any distortions. And in fact, if we tax the rents that people have because they have no bid contracts with the government for military contracts, or we tax the rents that people, shareholders, and managers have because they can sell drugs to Medicare without competitive bidding. If you can tax the rents that occur because the very wealthy have control over the rules that put them first in bankruptcy, then you actually have less rent seeking, and you have some revenue to invest in, I like the list, infrastructure, technology, and education. So that's the second reason this book is very powerful, really one of the most important popular economics books written in the last 5 or 6 years. The third reason to buy the book is you get a really good list of things we can do now to reform the economy. You get that list, that agenda. He points out in rent seeking that there's 2 ways to get great wealth. One is to create it through innovation, really good ideas. The other is to steal it through rent seeking. It's a great line. And what we have to do at the state of the legislature in the realm of our democracy is to change those rules. Now, I'm not going to have you show your hands how many of you have student loans, but one of the, or know people, or you yourself are underwater in your mortgages. But there's a really nice description of how we change mortgage laws so that people can stay in their homes. The banks have to write down their mortgage values, and we actually save neighborhoods. It's a great description there. We also talk about a way to change bankruptcy laws, because people who are the less powerful in those contracts actually can get some power back through our democracy. So there's 3 really good reasons to buy the book, and I'm really glad you wrote it.
Go ahead, Michael. Thank you, Teresa.
Thanks. Well, I also enjoyed the book very much, and I think in Joe's writing, not just in this book, but in other books, you have an ability to pull a number of things together and put together a story which is very compelling. In this book, and I don't think you had time really to talk about it this evening, was the fact that there are many examples in the book about what is this price of inequality, how it affects real people, and you go through for example, in education and housing, in health, some references to longevity. It's very powerful because it makes the connection between the macro and what this actually means to society. So I'm a great fan, and I think it's terrific. But I'd like to push you a little bit further in a couple of dimensions. The first is that I think most of us now well, this country is largely an urban country. The population, we live mostly in cities. And I think that one of the things that would be interesting to think about, and I'd love your reactions to this, is how does this play out in, if you will, the geography of inequality, the spatial aspects of inequality? Because historically we've lived in periods where cities have been heavily segregated. And now as these patterns of economic differentiation have greater impact, how will this show up? Will the notion of the suburbs change? How do we think about the internal organization of cities? And in fact, what's sort of the geography of risk to some of the factors that you're talking about? So the first real question I have is what's the spatial basis of inequality beyond just housing and health and some of these sectors? The second thing, which I think relates to your being a macroeconomist, is thinking, is all this really dependent on the macroeconomists? Can we also imagine that below Washington, at other levels of governmentality, of the states, of the cities, even of communities, there are responses to the kind of pathologies that we're now seeing? And I think that that's a really important part of the story. There is an agenda for reform. That's sort of the what. But the question that I would be interested in putting out is the how and the who. And how can reform and change occur? I mean, for example, in this city or in Los Angeles or Chicago or wherever we are, we see that there's enormous differences in investment in infrastructure, investment in education. The chances, if I know your zip code in this city, I can truly tell you what's going to happen with your kids based on the public services, environmental problems, all of these things. And I think that's part of the consequences of this deepening inequality that results from the macro. So I'd be interested in your thoughts about this, how you can come down at another level. Thanks.
There you go. Yeah.
Yeah. Let me first answer the question about the geography. And I discussed this a little bit in the book. One of the interesting aspects of what the change in the geographic pattern is that we're living today in, you might say, more economically segregated communities than we've ever been. An interesting study that came out of Stanford, somebody, Kendra Bischoff, and I forget the co-author, but why that's particularly important is related to the notion of inequality of opportunity, because we have schools, public schools, that are based on local community. And that means we used to have communities that had both rich and poor, but right now we have communities that are more economically segregated. If you're born in a poor community, you go to poor schools, and your potential for upward mobility is greatly reduced. Another interesting aspect of the growing inequality that has come out in a couple of recent studies is that people pattern of consumption is affected by their neighbors. So if they live near people who are richer, then, and not necessarily very near, but even in the vicinity, they tend to consume more. And particularly they consume more than they should. So you can look at levels of indebtedness in communities in which there's more inequality, and what you see is more indebtedness. And that, of course, obviously, again, has all kinds of repercussions. On the issue of redistribution, or of trying to address the problem of inequality at the local level rather than the national level, this is a real problem in a federal system, because businesses particularly can easily move, and so can individuals. And so it's very difficult to have very progressive taxation at the state level, at the state and local level, because if you do, the businesses will move out, and better off individuals will move out. And that's why the responsibility for creating a more equal society has to be basically at the federal level. Having said that, there are lots of things that individual states, communities can do, and you mentioned some of them. what's interesting is what a state like New York can do is actually very significant. You know, New York has been at the lead in prosecuting, in trying to make our financial system work better. Now, we still have some responsibility because Wall Street's here, but the fact is that the Attorney General in New York has been much better in prosecuting many of these cases than the federal government and the Attorney General of the United States. An interesting thing, and it may be partly because at the state level there's more accountability through the democratic process than at the federal level, where money often seems to have more influence.
I have one question.
No.
Last night, if any of you watched the debates, the issue of jobs it came up a lot, and perhaps we can make the argument a little better than it was made last night, about how some of the ideas to tax people above $250,000 per year, or even to implement the Buffett tax, to change the treatment of capital gains and treat it like income tax. How exactly or approximately would that actually help create jobs? How would a tax on the very wealthy be a job creation move?
Yeah, so let me begin with the opposite side, which is what you hear from the more conservative. And they say the people at the top are the job creators, and really dangerous to tax them. And there's so many things wrong with that argument that it's hard to know where to begin. The first thing is that you know, all the Romney's running for the presidency has put a focus on some of these private equity firms. And actually it turns out that they're really good at job destroying rather than job creation. I mean, part of the way that they've made money is they do these leveraged buyouts where they get a lot of debt, they restructure. Restructuring means firing workers. And often in ways that pension funds are robbed and protections are undermined. I guess you probably know about how the details of how that works out. But the second point is that there's no, in a globalized world, these individuals or corporations are not focusing on what is good for the United States. They're asking a simple question: how can I make the most money? And how do you make the most money? Well, right now they look around the world and they say, I can hire workers more cheaply in China or India or some other country than in the United States. So they take their money and they use that to create jobs abroad. And in fact, one of the distortions in our current tax code is that it actually encourages people to keep their money abroad and invest it abroad. One of the reasons why people have their money in the trust funds in the Cayman Islands is that you don't have to pay taxes until you bring it back. So if you keep your money abroad, invest it abroad, create jobs abroad, then you don't have to pay taxes back in the United States until you repatriate the funds. So that's the second fundamental fact. But go back to what I said, talked about that we tax capital gains speculators at a much lower rate than we tax people who work for a living. If you engage in land speculation, you don't create more land. This goes back to the original definition of rent. So taxing the rents on land doesn't lead to the creation of anything. So the point is that I think there are arguments you could put forward, I don't always agree with them, but there are arguments that you could put forward that if you create jobs, employment, you ought to get favorable tax treatment. But that's an argument that says, okay, to a corporation, if you invest in the United States in employment generating activities, then you will get a tax deduction, a favorable tax treatment. But if you just are, you know, why have an across-the-board tax cut for, say, corporation? And the same thing on capital gains. Most of capital gains arises from land speculation, CDS, you know, financial market speculation, not from creating new businesses. So I can understand saying, okay, if we create a new business, that's one thing, but not all these other kinds of sometimes even destructive economic activities. So to come back to the way you posed the question, if you taxed these activities at a higher rate, that would give you revenues that you could invest in, say, infrastructure and technology and education. That would increase the productivity of the economy. It would increase the productivity of investment. So it would actually, what we call, crowd in private investment. And interestingly, the investments that were made on infrastructure in the Great Depression are widely thought to be part of the basis of the growth that we had in the subsequent decades.
Oh, sorry, the wrong end. We want to take some questions from the audience, and we have 3x5 file cards. So I think just raise your hand, and someone will come to you, and you can put the question down, and then we'll collect them up here. So, but while they're doing that, do you have other things you'd like to ask Professor Stiglitz?
One of the things that's implied in the book, I mean, occasionally you mention, is the fact that the perception of the United States from outside has changed dramatically. Do you think that we can recover from this? Do you think that we actually can increase productivity and find a new frontier in some sense in the way we organize the economy, or is this really the beginning of an end, as has been described in some countries?
I want to remain a little bit more hopeful than that, because I want to believe that we can change course. And you know, if I thought it was inevitable, I would have written a book. You know, I would just watch this scenario, this drama go on in a depressing way. I wrote the book because I thought there is some hope. But I did want to talk about one aspect of perceptions I didn't have time to talk about. One of the striking studies that I mentioned in the book is one that describes Americans' perception of themselves and what they think of as a good society. And what is striking is Americans believe that we are much more equal than we really are. They don't understand the degree of inequality. People, this one study drew a kind of a pie chart, and they said, you know, which society would you like to be in? And one was one with a fairly high degree of inequality, and one was one with a lot of inequality. And the vast majority said they didn't want a society with complete equality. That was boring, and that's not what they wanted. But they wanted one with a high degree of equality. And they thought that was where America was. The interesting thing is, the degree of equality that they thought they wanted was the equality that described Sweden. And the equality that they didn't want was the inequality that described the United States. So there's a real problem of perception here, and I think that if one, you know, tries to understand, explains where things are, there'll be different reactions. One other aspect of this kind of misperception has to do also with this degree of equality of opportunity, Horatio Alger story, everybody can make it to the top. And one of the reasons for that is you read newspaper stories about people who've made it from the bottom to the top. And, you know, part of my reaction is, you know, the newspapers are not going to write a story about a dog that bit a person. They're going to write a story about a person that bit a dog. So the reason that these stories get attention is that they are so unusual. And the statistics look very much the other way. But this perception that everybody, including themselves, are going to make it to the top affects attitudes like attitudes towards the inheritance tax. Inheritance tax is really important because it prevents our society from becoming a plutocracy, inherited plutocracy. And interestingly, people like Warren Buffett have come out and said we ought to have high inheritance taxes because he doesn't want to live in a society, he doesn't want his children to live in a society of plutocracy. But the majority of Americans are against the inheritance tax. Even though the number of people in the United States right now to pay the inheritance tax for a couple, you have to have more than $10 million of bequest. And for most Americans, that's not a problem. Having any bequest is really the problem. And you say, how could they have this attitude? And part of the reason is they all believe that they're going to be these multi-millionaires. They're going to worry about how much money, how many millions they're going to leave to their children. So this misperception, it leads to these kinds of, I think, very peculiar policy positions.
Why don't we, let me give you a couple of questions from the audience. And actually, some of these are a little tougher than the ones you've been posing. So what was your role in various ways what was your role in various ways in Clinton's deregulation of the economy, and how do you feel about that now?
Well, they weren't selling this before they came in, but they ought to read my book, Roaring '90s, because I actually answer the question in that book. The issue of, in particular, the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, which a lot of people think was, I think, was a pivotal in the financial crisis, but there were other acts like the act that said that we would not regulate derivatives no matter what. We wouldn't regulate them as insurance products, as gambling instruments, or as financial instruments. The issue of repeal of Glass-Steagall, I oppose that very strongly, and for three obvious reasons. One is the reason we passed Glass-Steagall in the aftermath of the stock market crash in the 30s was because there had been all sorts of conflicts of interest that would arise again if we repealed it. And that turned out to be very clear in the Enron scandal and the scandals that began in the beginning of the century. Secondly, I worried that Glass-Steagall separates commercial banks and investment banks. Investment banks take money from rich people, commercial banks from ordinary people. The commercial banks are supposed to have very conservative investment policies. Investment banks can have much more risk-taking. I worried that the risk-taking gambling mentality of the investment banks would spread down to the commercial banks, and that would be not good for our economy. That turned out to be right as well. And the third one was that by breaking down these walls, you would wind up with bigger and bigger banks, less competition, and in particular, the problem of too big to fail banks would become much more serious. And that also happened. Well, I can say that while I was in the Council of Economic Advisors through beginning of 1997, we successfully battled the attempts to repeal the Glass-Steagall. And it wasn't until 1998-99 when Citibank wanted to be formed to bring together travelers insurance and make a universal bank, that the lobbyists really came out in strength, campaign contributions and all that, and the revolving doors all worked together perfectly, and we got the repeal and we got the law that, to me, quite astounding that we would not regulate the derivatives. That was, even after long-term capital management crashed and put at brink the whole global economy, and you had the head of the CFTC, the regulatory agency, saying something had to be done about it. You had the people from, you had the Fed and the U.S. Treasury, you won't know the names, saying if we regulate derivatives, it will be the end of capitalism. And they passed this law saying that we could not regulate derivatives, that nobody could regulate them, and we know what happened after that.
Great. So the short answer is you had nothing to do with it.
The short answer, I stopped it for a while, I think, or at least I contributed to stopping it for a while.
Now here's another question. During the last 60 years, the world rapidly urbanized. China's urbanization rate grew along with inequality. Have you found a correlation between the growth of urbanization and the growth of inequality?
I thought that was a question from you, wasn't it? No, I'm teasing. Let me say, in the early stages of development, there is a tendency for inequality to rise. This is sometimes referred to as the Kuznets curve, and the idea that some parts of a country do better initially, and others don't keep up, and so you get gaps, particularly in large countries like China. But then the parts that have fallen behind eventually catch up, and then inequality gets reduced. So there is this notion that in the early stages of development, where there's this kind of urbanization, that there is this process of growing inequality. But that's why when I say the United States has more inequality than any of the other advanced countries, I focus on the advanced countries because that is considerably different from these developing countries.
Another question. Can you comment on the impact of inheritance tax on inequality? And I think the question is, does inheritance tax really do anything given its scale?
Well, I think, let me put it like this, the absence of an inheritance tax would have a big effect. It would lead to help create a plutocracy, a perpetuation. So I think it's an important piece of social legislation, as well as a way of raising revenues in ways that is, I think, a pretty good way of raising revenues. Maybe.
So Peter Diamond has a really good idea about the estate tax. When Social Security was formed, we actually grandfathered a lot of grandfathers. People who never paid Social Security tax before, because the system wasn't involved, got benefits. They got benefits starting in 1940. And that deficit just perpetuated, throughout the system. It was a legacy debt. His idea is that if you actually take the estate tax, the inheritance tax, and just pay off that legacy debt, then you're actually paying legacies, for a legacy deficit. So it makes sense that sometimes we have social programs that we take on a debt. People who are unfortunate or old need money, that you take people who got the money without doing any work can pay back. So that's my idea for this.
There's one more aspect that I should probably mention that a lot of people may not fully realize, that our tax code actually allows a lot of people to effectively escape taxation because of this provision called step-up of basis at death. So if you have capital gains, first of all, you're taxed at a much lower rate. But secondly, you don't pay the tax until you realize the capital gains. But thirdly, if you decide not to realize the capital gains and to pass on the asset to your children, the capital gains from the time you acquire the asset to the time that your children inherit it goes totally without any taxation. And that's a huge distortion. one of the kinds of gimmicks that a lot of the wealthy people used for a while is they figured out a way using derivatives so that they could even consume the good and pretend that they hadn't. It's a complicated thing, and it's finally been made illegal, but there are ways of using these derivatives so that you can have your cake and eat it too.
Good. Here's a small question. Can you comment on the economic problems of Europe?
Well, maybe I should give a quick answer. Yes. But I think they wanted more than that. Can I comment? Would I comment is what they meant to say. Europe has a number of, I'm very pessimistic about Europe, and it's not, economists are dismal science, so it comes naturally to us to be, but I'm really dismal, pessimistic about it. But first, and the fundamental problem is that when the euro was created, it was not an optimal currency area. My colleague at Columbia, Bob Mundell, wrote a paper about what were the conditions under which a group of countries could share a common currency, and you look at Europe, it doesn't satisfy those conditions. You took away two important adjustment mechanisms, interest rate and exchange rate, and they hadn't put anything in its place. They assumed that if you had enough similarity, it would be able to work, and they assumed that you could get enough similarity, they called it convergence criteria, by ensuring that they didn't have too much deficit and too much debt. But that was wrong. Ireland and Spain had a surplus before the crisis. It wasn't debt that caused the problem. And what I find disturbing is that many of the leaders of Europe still are focusing on that misconception that all you need to do to make euro work is to make sure that they don't spend too much. In fact, the result of that is this drive for austerity is actually bringing Europe, it's in recession now. In fact, countries like Spain and Greece are in depression. 25% unemployment, 50% youth unemployment, and with no hope in sight. But to give you just one more aspect of what has gone wrong, or what is wrong with the structure, is they created what's called the single market principle. The capital can move everywhere. A Spaniard can easily put his money in a German bank, and the euros can move easily around. What does that mean? Well, backing any country's banking system is the government. And we saw that in 2008. If our government hadn't bailed out our banks, they would all have been bankrupt. So what does that mean? That means that there is an implicit subsidy. What it means is that if you have your money in a Spanish bank, you know that the Spanish government is not very able to back you up. So what do? You move your money to a German bank. Well, what does that mean? That means Spanish banks are weaker. And what does that mean? They lend less, the economy gets weaker, combining the effect of austerity, a depressing economy, credit crunch going on. That means government revenue is less, the banks are weaker. And what does that mean? Less confidence in the banking system, more money leaves Spain, and the system unravels. This instability was there from the start, but wasn't recognized. And the problem is, it's still not fully recognized. They say we have to have a common banking system. What they've said is, oh, that means common supervision. That's not enough. You need deposit insurance, common resolution, and many of the leaders say, in Germany say, yes, we understand that, but we have to do one step at a time. The economics won't allow the politics to move in this process that they say will take several years. Things are more likely to fall apart. But there's one more thing I want to say about the Euro framework that's in a way related to my book and to the question that you asked earlier, in Europe, this problem of the race to the bottom is worse than it is within the United States. I said that it's very hard to have progressive taxation at the state level. The European system with free mobility of capital, goods, people, people makes it very difficult to have progressive taxation. I was visiting France just a couple of weeks ago when the richest person in France announced that he's going to be moving to Belgium because he doesn't want to pay taxes. He didn't say that way, but it was the same day that Holland decided that he was going to raise taxes. He announced he was leaving. Interestingly, he makes his money out of luxury goods selling to the 1%. So it's a real closed circle here of inequality leading to more inequality. That's a real problem in Europe in the way they structured it without any real adequate, strong, central federal government structure. The ability to have progressive taxation, progressive programs, has certainly been weakened.
Coming back home, you repeatedly mention a barrier to increasing equality is the current campaign finance system and the revolving door of lobbying activities. What's your opinion on the various strategies being pursued to combat the role of money in American politics?
Well, the first thing is, I think it's important to elect a Democratic Congress in Obama, because the danger of having a Supreme Court of the kind that that rules in Citizens United, or I don't know if you know about the Arizona case, I talk about it very briefly in my book, which basically they tried, one of the states tried to create a framework that leveled the playing field. If one candidate raised more money than another, it said the state would help make it the campaign more equal. They said that was unconstitutional. I mean, to me, just an amazing decision. That fair, what they said is undoing inequality was unconstitutional. So the bottom line is, it does make a difference who gets elected, because the next Supreme Court could be worse than the current one, or it could be better. Now, even within the Citizens United, there are a framework which says corporations are people and have unlimited ability to make campaign contributions. There are things that you could do. Senator Schumer has been actually thinking about this, pushing some of these ideas. One of them is, for instance, that corporations are supposed to be owned by their shareholders. We don't really take that too seriously, but one aspect of that is being owned by your shareholders. The shareholders should have some say in the pay of the CEOs. The CEOs didn't like that idea. They said that would be, again, the end of capitalism as they know it, as we know it, and it would be the end of capitalism as they know it in terms of what they could get out. But another provision that we could change, just again, the corporate governance laws, we could say that you can't make campaign contributions, or you can't get involved, make contributions to these particular kinds of causes without a shareholder vote. And if you had that, very few of these would probably go through. So there are mechanisms that we can use even within the current constraints that would dampen, I think, some of these abuses.
Well, I think we have time for two more questions. One's a big question, the other's a little smaller one. So first of all, this is the easy question. What's the ideal healthcare system? Now, the fact that two presidential candidates couldn't get it last night doesn't mean you can't answer that. So.
Well, I think that, my feeling, and I think increasingly among economists, there is a feeling that a single-payer system is the only way that to get it to work. You want to say anything, or? Okay, so we have a consensus here, at least, at the new school. The new school has decided that the single payer is the way to go. We'll send a message to both of the presidential candidates.
It'll be a done deal.
A done deal, okay. That was the easy question.
Well, that was easy. Okay. This is a tough one. Do you think an actual academic economist could become president and maybe pursue some of your similar suggested policies?
No. But there have been academics, presidents of universities. Woodrow Wilson became president. So it does happen. And what was interesting is he did pursue a number of ideals that were very important as president and had a lot of influence in creating the League of Nations and internationalism. But I think that particularly politics in America right now is you have to be very different. Some of the sound bites are very different from what academics are used to. As you may have noticed, my answers are not as short as they would be if I were on a TV show. But what I do want to emphasize, though, is I think that our political process, there's still some hope. I want to go back to the idea of hope. There's still some hope that our political process will work and that these ideas will get integrated into our political process. Not necessarily in the vocabulary. You know, I don't expect the president to talk about rank seeking and all that. But what is true, there's a lot of discussion about what's happening to the middle class. The fact that median income is going down is a way, he doesn't talk about median income, but when he says the middle class is being squeezed, when he pushed for a loan, reforming the loan program, he was being sensitive to some of the issues that we're talking about, and there's a long list of these issues, and I think that the more sensitive one becomes to these issues, I think there's can be a broader consensus on many of these issues. I want to mention one thing that we were talking about before that related to the last question, which is health. And one of the things I meant to mention in my exposition is that inequality gets reflected not only on income and wealth, but on a whole variety of other statistics, including health. And one of the, maybe you want to talk about some of the numbers of it.
We were talking about that we should look at the inequality of wealth and income, but also just length of life. And so one of the things I think you're going to expand upon is that our health system and our inequality has meant that longevity gains have gone to people at the top. All the longevity gains in the United States have gone to people who make above the median income, all of them. White men above the median income have gotten the biggest gains in longevity. And that's because of our system, our health system, where we live, our spatial inequality, and all sorts of other things that make people die sooner, which is hopelessness, joblessness, and just a sense that there's no way out.
And at the bottom, some recent statistics, they have to be interpreted carefully, but the numbers are so dramatic that it's hard not to mention them. At the very bottom, life expectancy in the United States has gone down over the last, what is it, 15, 20 years?
20 years. It was
20 years has gone down among women by 4 years. Right. These are numbers comparable to what was happening worse than what was happening in the Soviet Union at the end of when the Iron Curtain fell down and the transition. And we use that as an indicator of how bad things were doing, how bad things were going. We said, you know, income data is not quite reliable, but something that we know is a good indicator of things not going well is the decrease in life expectancy, which was going down there by 2 years, while the rest of the world was going up by about 2 years. In the United States, among the bottom, among women, life expectancy has gone down by more than 4 years. And that actually say is another indicator of how serious the situation has become in the United States.
And what's interesting also is that in Africa, it's going up. So we're actually doing worse than some of the most poorest countries of Africa and South Asia. So it's really an extraordinary indicator, and I think we really need to pay attention to it. I think the other point, which Teresa referred to, is that there's a strong correlation between longevity and health expenditures and education and a whole variety of other things, environmental sanitation, these kind of problems. So, you know, these things go together, and I think it really calls for lots of work. We've got lots of work to do as an academic community to learn more about it.
Well, yeah. I thought you wanted to end on a note of hope, so
I meant to.
Maybe get that in, so then we can close it up.
Okay.
So, go ahead.
Well, one of the I'm having trouble. I'm struggling with my hope. But let me make question that I do talk a little bit about at the end of my book is how is it that it's possible that we can reverse the kind of political nexus, the nexus that greater economic inequality has led to greater political inequality, led to greater economic inequality. And there are basically two ways, and hopefully both of them will work. One of them is that those among, that more of the 1% realize that it's in their interest, and their enlightened self-interest, so sometimes call it self-interest rightly understood, for us to be a less divided society. That a divided society doesn't function very well, and not even they will benefit. And this is the perspective that, say, that Warren Buffett and George Soros and a lot of other people have taken. And the problem is, while there are many of those in the 1% who understand that, too many of them don't. The other hope is that the other 99% come to understand that they've been sold a bill of goods. The bill of goods is that what is in the interest of the 1% is in their interest. And it's not. That we talked about the estate tax, we talked about a number of, the capital gains tax, we talked about all these, bankruptcy law, all these things. These laws and regulations, tax structures that the 1% has been advocating really are against the interest of the 99%. And if the 99% come to understand that there is this difference in interest, maybe they will go and vote in a way that reflects their own interest, and that will create a more equal society.
Good, good. Well, thank you very much, Joseph. I know we've all benefited from this great discussion. I want to thank you for being here, but I also want to thank the entire audience for being with us this evening, and I look forward to welcome as many of you back as possible at future events. Thank you.